All right, today we're going to talk about the square, or should I say the squares, because this is really two, maybe even three different types of learnings that we're all packing into one thing. And so this is one of those things that we're not going to be able to teach in 2 weeks. We're going to become familiar with terminology in 2 weeks. This is really a long-term learning thing. I've got a friend who went to the Air Force Academy, and he said, "Yeah, this was a whole class for us." And that's just for one of the different squares we're going to teach. Same thing for the spiritual side of it, whatever it is. There's a lot here. The square is really about progression. How do we progress? And there's this great verse in Ephesians 4:14 where Paul has this amazing statement. He says he's contrasting two things. First, you look at it in Ephesians 4. There we go. He says, first of all, he says, the goal here is that we're going to be mature in Christ. We're going to be mature in Christ. And in my old beat-up Bible, I've got this whole part in yellow because this is just a really key area. And it talks about, this is the famous passage where Paul's like, okay, he gave some to be prophets, some to be apostles, evangelists, all this stuff, to prepare God's people for works of service. And then he says, because then that's going to be awesome, man. We're all until we all reach unity in the faith and the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature. And so when we use this language all the time, if you're in Christian circles, you've heard this. This is where it comes from. This idea of being a mature Christian. And this is what Paul says, man, the goal is maturity. I want you to be mature. Then we'll no longer be infants, tossed around back and forth by the waves, blown here and there by every wind of teaching, the cunning and craftiness of men and their deceitful scheming, right? So tell me what you really think, Paul. But he says, man, right now we're all infants, but we're going to grow and become mature. And this really is the key to Christian life. So one of the things that I've consistently found is that most of us confuse novelty for growth. I had a professor in college who used to say the brain responds to novel stimuli. And so we think we're growing if we're hearing something new that we haven't heard before. So huddle for you is like, oh, I'm growing. I'm hearing all these things I've never heard before, right? But we think we're growing if we're hearing something new. But the reality is that's not actually growth. That's just novelty. America is just addicted to novelty. We've always been addicted to novelty. I want to hear new things. I want to see new things. That's just what it is. And so anything that I feel like I've heard before, I'm like, yeah, I got that. So people will come and they'll hear a sermon and they're like, yeah, I've heard all that before. So, well, you doing any of it? Well, no, but I already know all that. Well, knowledge is not the same thing as maturity, right? Knowledge is just knowledge. And so there is this thing in the church where we get proud of our discerning palate in terms of what we consume. And then when stuff stops being interesting to us, then we stop eating it. We're like, well, I'm just not being fed, right? And the problem with that is that the food hasn't changed. What's changed is that you're not eating it, right? So a different point in Scripture in Hebrews, Paul, or the writer of Hebrews, says he talks about not just drinking milk but eating meat. And so a lot of Christians really glom onto that, right? Like, oh, I'm not a milk drinker. I want the beef. Where's the beef, right? The thing is that infants eat beef. My youngest son Isaac, when he was 8 months old, he started eating steak. He loved steak. Steak was his favorite thing to eat. I just had to cook it for him and cut it up into very small pieces, and I'd give him a little piece, and he'd just sit there and numb it to death before he had any teeth. He loved steak. Or the flip side of that is he and I used to eat the same breakfast every morning. We'd have oatmeal and banana. And so I would take a banana and mash up half a banana, and I would make his oatmeal, and I'd mix it into his oatmeal, and I'd sit there and spoon feed him. And then when I finished, I would just, like, whatever he didn't eat, I would put in my bowl, and then I'd mix myself some oatmeal and slice in a banana, and I'd feed myself. And the difference between what he eats and what I eat, whether it's soft banana or whether it's a nicely cut up steak, the difference in what we're eating is not the food itself. Calorically, it's the same. The difference is I had to make it and feed him, whereas he couldn't feed himself. And so really, when we think about maturity or spiritual growth, what happens is we actually go through this phase. We go through this normal sequence where you start out as an infant. And what that means is somebody else makes the food and they feed you. And then at some point you grow to be a child. And that means that somebody else makes the food, but you can feed yourself, right? So my 10-year-old, we make dinner, kids sit down, they eat it, it's fine. Somebody else, I had to make the food, but they can feed themselves, or my wife, or one of us makes the food, right? Then what happens if all goes right, and some people never leave this space, but if all goes right, eventually you become an adult. And you can make your own food and you can feed yourself. All right. Now, I'm not saying you're a world-class chef. All right. But yeah, I can cook for myself. I can make my own food. I'm an adult. And then the last stage that some of us, not everybody, but a lot of us go through, is as a parent. And culinarily speaking, what does it mean to be a parent? It means that you make food and feed someone else. So you're back to doing this thing, right? You're mashing up the banana and giving it to the infant. And that's the cycle of life right there. This is it. You start as an infant. Somebody else makes the food. They feed it to you. Somebody else makes the food, but you can feed yourself. You make your own food and feed yourself. You make your own food and you feed other people. This cycle is how all spiritual formation works. So that's like the first square. But here's the thing. This same sequence happens in all different areas of life. There was a really famous book written by Ken Blanchard called The 1 Minute Manager. And you're like, 1 minute manager, what can you do in a minute? And he this is like back in the 80s, 70s maybe, he started talking about this thing called situational leadership. The first time I ever heard this, I was in a class in seminary, and the professor, he comes in and he says, all right, guys, and lady, he says, both. He says, let me ask you a question. What's the best type of leadership? What's the best way to lead? And so just puts it out there, and everybody starts arguing about it, right? Like, oh, I think leaders need to work this way. Oh, well, the best leaders I ever had, the best people I've ever followed work this way. Well, my style is more like this. So we get this whole fight, and he's just watching it and smiling. So we finish, the thing winds down, and we haven't been able to decide on the best way to lead, right? We have aphorisms that we're quoting at each other, but nobody really can come to agreement on the best way to lead. And what we found out, what we discovered, Jim Estep was his name, what he pointed out is that the best way to lead depends on the person you're leading. So if you've got a leadership style that's really like, I'm going to empower you, go do your thing, and you get somebody who's brand new and doesn't know what they're doing, they will crash and burn and hate you, right? They're like, man, I never felt supported. Or if you're like really in there with them and it's, you're just real involved, and it's somebody who knows what they're doing, they're like hating being micromanaged by you. And so what we talked about is there's this thing, Ken Blanchard's idea, called situational leadership. Situational leadership is the idea that we lead appropriately to the people that we're leading. The way that we lead people depends on the people that we're leading. And you're like, well, obviously, why would you not do that? Well, you'd think that, but the reality is mostly what we do, we are mostly only fluent in one way of leading. Most of us we have a primary way that we lead, and that's really the only way that we're fluent in leading. And so we kind of go through, you could call this the second square or maybe the third square. We go through 4 phases. I don't think I have enough space. We're going to do this. We go through 4 phases when we learn anything. And this is like playing the piano. This is cooking a meal. This is putting together a Bible study. This is leading a huddle. This is teaching tools. This is whatever it is you're doing. You go through 4 phases. And the first stage is called unconscious. I can't decide if I'm upper or lowercase there. Let's just say it's all lowercase. Unconscious incompetence. You're like, unconscious incompetence, that sounds awful. Well, it is. What this is this is where most of us are when we don't know what we're doing, right? When I first started trying to take pictures, I was like, I got a camera, how hard can it be, right? So it's just, I don't even know what I don't know. It's just like, well, everything looks easy to somebody who doesn't know how to do it, right? Oh, well, yeah, sure, how hard can it be? Well, it can be pretty darn hard. There's a lot that goes into it. People say, well, you make that look easy. Well, yeah, I've done this before. So unconscious incompetence means I don't know, unconscious, I don't know that I don't know what I'm doing. And so if we're drawing the square, let me see how far over I can get over here. There we go. That's like a 1. All right. And when you're unconsciously incompetent, you're like, I don't know how to do it. I don't even know that I don't know how to do it. The next, and I'm going to come this way a little bit. The next phase is conscious incompetence. Conscious incompetence. And that means I don't know what I'm doing, but at least I know I don't know what I'm doing, right? I'm aware of my lack. The third phase that we get into is conscious, let me put that right there, conscious competence. And this is like, I'm not great at this, but as long as I'm thinking about it, I can do it. Right? And then the fourth place, this is where we love to be. The fourth place is unconscious competence. Unconscious competence. And so, I misspelled all those words, conscious, but just do as I say, not as I write, okay? Let's just roll with it. So, unconscious competence. And what this is when you're good and you don't even think about it. Most of the stuff you're good at, you probably live right here, right? And so I don't care if it's filling out TPS reports or doing Photoshop or running or playing basketball. Like, you don't even think about it. Like, whatever the things are that you're good at, if you just made a list, most of those things you probably live here. Well, the thing is, what happens is when you try to show somebody, just be like me. Just do what I do. Let me lead you in this. What happens is they can't mimic you because you don't even know what you're doing anymore, because you do it unconsciously. And so what's helpful for me is thinking about this. Think about it like it's a house, all right? Like, you can only see, if you're right here, you can't see someone who's right here. You just can't even get there, right? So if somebody's people can a lot of times get from 1 up to 2 kind of on their own. Like, they can make it there. Sometimes they need help, but a lot of times, okay, I can get there. I can at least be aware of what I don't know. But this gap right here is the hardest of all of them to bridge. Because the people that you're following, you're like, I want to be like them. They're probably over here. And so it's like if this is a house, a top-down view of a house, right? You're looking down at the house. They're at one corner of the house and you're over here. They can't even see you to follow you. So what you really have to do is you have to learn to move yourself back to a 3. And you think, well, I don't want to think about it. I'm good at this. I just do it. Just do what I'm doing. But you're not followable until you can move back here. My friend Phil talked about this in terms of piano lessons. He says, I didn't want my kids to take piano lessons because I'm a great piano player. I'm a better piano player than that teacher is. And so I was hesitant to have my kids take piano lessons. And the reason is because I thought, well, I'm good at piano. I'm better at piano than the teacher. But he said, what I didn't realize is I don't know how to teach people how to play piano because I don't think about it. I just do it. It's just in me. I don't have to worry about it. And all my kids that I tried to teach piano to just got frustrated and quit. And I thought, like, man, they're just flaky. And not, man, I need to learn how to move back. And so really, the squares, when we think about the squares, it's actually this same process in 2 or 3 different ways, 2.5 maybe. So part of it is a spiritual formation piece where we go through this, being an infant to being a child to being an adult to being a parent. Got a lot of people in churches that are so proud of their maturity because, man, I'm just really discerning in the food that I eat. When actually what they are is they're picky eaters, right? They're in one of these places. And they can't cook a meal for themselves, but they're really picky about what they will and won't eat. So that's one way to draw the square. The second way is if we were getting into Ken Blanchard's leadership stuff, he actually draws a curve. If you look up situational leadership, that's long-term growth. There's a ton that we could talk about there. But then the third way is just to think about from a 1 to a 2 to a 3 to a 4, going through this process and whatever it is that we're doing, how do we both help ourselves move forward And then also, how do we help other people by being appropriate in our level of interaction with them? So I know that's a lot. I know this is a longer video than we thought, but it's because there's like 3 shapes in one. And really, this is just scratching the surface. This is not going to make you an expert in the squares, in situational leadership and spiritual formation. This just gives us a vocabulary and a concept that we can flesh out then over time. So I hope this was helpful, and I'm really excited to see you live this out in your own life. Talk to you guys soon.